of Rainforest Action Network. And today's topic is how to decolonize your diet, how to catalyze global change through local action. Next slide, please.
One second.
There we go. So to start off, it would be great to learn a little bit about everyone on the call. So if you could please put in the chat your name, pronouns, location, and why you're here today. As a quick reminder, this is the session description. But yeah, we're just very interested to know what your interest is in this topic. If anyone does want to start us off by unmuting yourself and talking, that would be great too. Great. And a couple of housekeeping things. So I think you're already doing a great job of this, but as we've got quite a lot of content to get through today, please mute yourselves during the call. There will be a time for question and answers at the end of the call. And if you would like to make comments and contributions throughout the session, please do so in the chat rather than speaking up. My colleague Catherine will be monitoring the chat and will interrupt either me or Maggie depending on the question. Excellent, thank you. Oh, exciting. Feeding People podcast, that sounds great. Thanks, Amy. Voice of the City, a youth gardening program, design, build, grow, eat. This is all great. Thank you very much. I'll leave everyone to keep putting that in the chat. I will get going on today's agenda. So we'll start off with some quick introductions from Chicago Fair Trade and Rainforest Action Network, the co-presenters of this call. We'll then look at the problem. We're going to be looking at exploitation in global trade and contextualizing that with some historical information about how we've got to where we are today. We'll then look at the solution to the problem, which is alternative trade that prioritizes people and planet. And we'll then talk about how you can be the solution, how you can be an ethical consumer as well as a campaigner. And as I said, we'll finish with a chance to discuss in the question and answer session. All right, so some introductions. So first off, we'll start with Chicago Fair Trade. I will hand over to my colleague, Catherine Bissell-Cordova, who is Executive Director, who can give our elevator pitch.
Hello, thanks for the intro, Nancy, and I'm so excited to see this big group here. This is really exciting for us. So yes, I'm the Executive Director of Chicago Fair Trade. We're a small organization, but a big organization because it was just one staff for many years, but we had the good fortune of hiring Nancy almost 2 years ago now, and we're the largest grassroots fair trade organization in the country. So we're the largest, but we're still just two, but we get a lot done. And basically, so we were started in 2006 as a project of the large international NGO Oxfam, which works to eradicate poverty. And then seeing fair trade as an important tool in the toolbox in which to tackle such a huge problem. And fair trade, which you'll learn more about, was already quite well established in Europe, particularly in the UK, but was just, we're behind in the United States. But so the organization Chicago Fair Trade was started to really hopefully spark kind of a movement here. And we like to think we have. When we started, it was really around when in my memory, but a lot of like when the local food movement really started coming together and becoming more and more widespread and embraced, which is wonderful, and we love it. And we love CIFPAC. We always go to CIFPAC events. I've been to many of the summits for years. And one thing, and we're very, fair trade, and we always see it as dovetailing with the local movement. So we're trying to get people, to think about what they're eating, what they're wearing, what gifts they buy, whatever, whenever you're consuming. And we are in the largest consumer society in the history of the world in the United States. And, to make people really, our overarching goal is to just make people start to think about that, which many more people do now. And Gen Zers, when we started in 2006, we didn't have computers in our hands and on our in our pockets, at our reach at all times. But now it's a much more common thought. But it was a common thing for people to think of this. But it was not as common in 2006. But over the years, as the local has grown, we want also people to be thinking about what they purchase that you can't buy locally made and sourced, which is where fair trade comes in. And so we really we do all sorts of events throughout the year. We work with schools, we work with universities and high schools, working with kids who are and students and young adults interested in this subject matter, and partner with them to help think of fun ways they can bring fair and engaging ways to bring fair trade to their campus. We led a big campaign that made Chicago be designated a fair trade city in 2011, meaning that there's access to fair trade products and fair trade education going on, and an ongoing group that continues to push fair trade, which is our organization. Every May, we do the biggest World Fair Trade Day event of the year. Every fourth quarter, usually November, December, this year, October, November, December, we run a fair trade holiday pop-up shop, which we've been doing for 10 years, which is quite popular and gives people a chance to be able to purchase fair trade. And we also have grown from 3 business members when we started in 2006 to 60 business members that all have a local Chicago tie. Most are locally owned, 90% are women owned, very small businesses, but working with makers and farmers in over 30 countries, as well as here in the United States. We also have some local social enterprises that are part of Chicago Fair Trade. So I could go on and on, but I won't, because there's a lot of good stuff to cover in this session.
Thanks, Catherine. And we'll take it over now to Maggie to introduce Rainforest Action Network.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm Maggie Martin. I'm a senior forest campaigner at Rainforest Action Network, which we call ourselves RAM. And I use she, her pronouns, and I'm calling from Chicago, but I live in Tennessee and historically Cherokee and Yuchi land. Rainforest Action Network is an environmental nonprofit organization. We've been around since 1985, so almost as long as me. And we do corporate campaigns and build people power to push the corporations. So we use an inside outside kind of strategy where we do both internal kind of negotiations and corporate engagement while also building people power to push from the outside. I'll pass it back to you, Nancy.
Great, thank you, Maggie. So on to the problem. So we're going to talk about exploitation and global trade today. And when we talk about that, it's useful, I find, to give some context about why global trade has become so exploitative. Next slide, please. So it's no surprise to anyone here that we live in a world of interrelated crises. Climate crisis is at the forefront of most of our minds at the moment, especially with the hottest February on record. Gender inequity is a huge problem. We have a gender pay gap in every single country in the world. And we have persistent racial inequity and income inequality. And trade really plays and has played a huge role in creating all of these. So I'd love someone to just shout out, as we're going to be talking about trade, what does trade mean to you? Can anyone give me a quick definition? Feel free to put it in the chat as well.
I would say that what trade means to me is I kind of think of trade as somewhat of a bartering system, but instead of like bartering with other items, we kind of barter with money.
Yeah.
But it's become more like, oh, this may not be worth the amount of money that you have, but I'm still gonna sell it to you so I can get more money. I think that's what it has become.
Yeah, great. And thank you, Kelly. And we have transactional movement of goods, exchange of resources, exchange of a commodity or product. This is exactly right. Move on to the next slide and give you the official definition. Trade, the activity of buying, selling, or exchanging goods or services between people, firms, or countries. So it could be as simple as buying something on Amazon as an individual. It could also be a country trading with another country. It could be trading goods for goods, which is barter. But we're really talking about transactions and exchanging goods and services. And something we talk about a lot at Chicago Fair Trade is the fact that the history of the world is the history of trade. I'll explain what we mean by that. So taking it back to 1492, Columbus arrives in the modern day Bahamas on a mission from the Spanish crown to find a route to India, China, Japan, and the Spice Islands. And his task is to bring back rich cargoes of silks and spices, particularly spices, which were very lucrative in this era. And from 1492 onwards, along with the opening of sea routes to Asia in the 16th century, this paves the way for European powers to colonize not only the Americas, but other parts of the world too. And they want to do this for many reasons. They want to find new sources of raw materials, which they can benefit from economically. They want to find cheap labor, people to work on those plantations to create these raw goods. They also want to find new markets for the goods that they produce domestically. And all of this is to enhance their power and prestige, and using trades as a means to do so. So I like to show this image when we talk about colonialism as a very simplified but quite effective metaphor for how it works. So you have the mother country here being served these commodities on platters from her servants, the colonies. So it's a pretty simple, maybe simplistic metaphor to show how transactional these relationships were, how beneficial they were to the colonizer, and how not very beneficial they were to the colonies. So this era lasts from the 16th to the 19th century, and the major European powers took over huge swathes of indigenous land for the reasons I discussed, to get power, to have these raw materials. And as a British person myself, I like to show this graphic. Only 22 countries in the world have never been invaded by Britain. Britain famously had a very powerful empire and a very vast empire. And if we're looking at the scale of this, this is all driven by the desire to trade. So it's important to bear in mind when we think about colonialism, trade should always really be in the back of our minds about what was actually happening. Next slide. And when we also talk about racial inequity today, so the civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter, these are all reactions against the systemic dehumanization of Black and brown people within trade. So an example of this is the triangle trade, a very, very extreme example of how people were used as goods. European slave traders would go over to the west coast of Africa. They would take enslaved people, traffic them to the Americas in the colonies, where they would be forced to work on plantations like cotton plantations, sugar plantations. And these goods would then be transported back to Europe. Many times they would be kind of transformed into products in Europe. For example, cotton was taken as a fiber and transformed into cotton fabric in factories in the north of England. And then these goods would then be taken back to the west coast of Africa to be exchanged for people. So again, we like to kind of emphasize how big a role trade has played in creating the racial inequity that we still see today. And skipping forward to the modern day, we see that these colonial era commodities still dominate trading routes internationally. So let's take a look at this map of Africa. 23 of the 27 countries ranked by the World Bank as low-income economies are located in Africa, which is why I'm using this as an example. But you'll see the kinds of products here that are the most valuable exports for each of the countries in Africa are things like cotton, gold, oil, coffee, tea, diamonds. You can imagine all of these being shipped on 16th century cargo ships. And in reality, these supply chains have not changed that much over the past few centuries. Also important to note that the transatlantic slave trade had a very detrimental impact on Africa, particularly the West Coast. 4 centuries of slave trading basically took the working population, really removed them from their homelands. And of course, that's going to naturally have an effect on economic and agricultural development. Not to mention that Europeans controlled about 90% of Africa by the early 20th century. So the resources, the financial resources were being extracted from Africa at that point as well. And when we look at the most common fair trade products today, we will see that colonial era commodities still dominate. They're among the top fair trade certified products. So bananas, cocoa, coffee, cotton, sugar and tea, flowers and plants, slight outlier probably, but all of these are colonial commodities. So this is something we really like to remind people, as Catherine said, you know, often in CIFPAC events, local sustainably grown produce is touted as the ideal, but we also like to shine a light on those crops that we can't grow locally or even domestically. And a really good quote to sum this up is this Martin Luther King Jr. quote: "Before you finish eating breakfast in the morning, you've depended on more than half the world." And this actually formed the basis for one of our exhibits at the Chicago Fair Trade Museum. Show you some pictures. And this is just a map of the world showing some common breakfast items and where they come from. And I'll pass over to Maggie to talk about forest risk commodities.
Thanks, Nancy. So as we're talking about unfair trade and these commodities that have historically been unfair, we also want to highlight that they're forest risk commodities as well. And so they're threatening critical forests around the world. And we're going to dig in a little bit deeper to palm oil, to sugar, to coffee. But some of the other forest risk commodities that folks should be aware of are soy, beef and leather, rubber, cocoa. And so these are all kind of threatening critical forests around the world. Next slide, please. Does anyone want to, or would you please take a moment to guess what percentage of products in grocery stores contain palm oil? Right, good guesses. Thank you all. We can go to the next slide. So actually about 50% of products in our store shelves contain palm oil. It's used in everything from personal care items, cosmetics, lotions, shampoos, to cleaning products like dish soap and laundry detergent, to many of the foods that we eat as well. 85% of palm oil is grown in tropical forest areas in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea. The trade of palm oil, the import of palm oil into the US has grown almost 500% over the past decade. And part of that was a big run away from hydrogenated oils. But that big expansion has led to increased deforestation. Next slide. Yeah, so palm oil is destroying rainforests through that plantation expansion, and it's harming critical wildlife. Sorry, for areas where tigers, orangutans, rhinos, all live in the last remaining ecosystem together. Those lands are under threat. Sorry, are you all also seeing the slides move around? Okay.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. I was like, is this just me? It also threatens forest peoples, people who depend almost exclusively on the forest for their lives and livelihoods. Folks who get their food, their medicine, They get supplies for their economic activities, like resin that comes from specific Camanyan trees that gets sold for medicine and perfume, for bamboo and rattan that's used for weaving and building, to all the food and the medicine that people use. And then also when those forests are destroyed, it destroys the watersheds in these communities, which are critical for drinking water and for the food that people grow to eat. And it's also causing climate change when these forests are destroyed. So they're huge carbon sinks, these forests and these peatlands. And so when they're destroyed, that carbon is released. And then we also lose the ability to absorb more carbon and to handle these big weather incidents that are happening from climate change. So we see a lot of flooding, a lot of landslides that result in these areas of deforestation. So a quote I'll share from one of the community activists that's working on one of these active struggles to protect land in the Long-Esoon community. She says, "I have a beautiful village, a beautiful forest, a beautiful river full of freshwater fishes. When the orchid blooms, it smells so good. I don't want this forest to become damaged just for rich people's wealth." And that's really true. It's, you know, a lot of the land has been destroyed to increase the wealth of people who are already extraordinarily and unfortunately wealthy. And so, yeah, we're really working with these communities to protect that land. And one is this Long-Esoon community, which is a pristine protected forest right now that's under threat. Next slide, and I'll pass it back to Nancy.
Thanks, Maggie. Okay, quick question. Who here drinks coffee? I know I do. Yeah, I can see Maggie does. I think a lot of people probably drink coffee. Next slide. And which country do you think produces the most coffee? This is always a trivia question that for some reason people really enjoy. So please put your guesses in the chat. Okay, Ethiopia, Brazil, Colombia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Madagascar. Great guesses. These are great. Next slide is actually Brazil. So coffee is grown today in more than 50 countries, which is kind of incredible. Somebody said Ethiopia. Ethiopia or Yemen is going to be, well, one of those countries is the origin of the coffee plant, but it's now grown in 50 countries worldwide, which really shows again the scale of colonial expansion and plantations. So it's grown across what's called the bean belt, where there are very specific climatic conditions where coffee is able to grow. And coffee is a fascinating fair trade commodity in that, or a fascinating commodity in that 125 million people worldwide depend on it for their livelihoods. And that's just under the population of Mexico, which is 128 million. So just to kind of contextualize how many people that is. And 80% of these people live at or below the poverty line. But when you think about coffee, it's pretty expensive compared to other things you buy in the grocery store. So there's definitely someone is definitely taking a cut of the profit here. One 2019 investigation showed that there was extensive slave labor happening, largely unchecked in Brazil's coffee industry specifically. And another problem that is less talked about is the fact that there's a huge brain drain within coffee. A lot of young people, because this is such hard physical labor, a lot of coffee farmers get up at 4 a.m. They earn very little money. There's not a lot of incentive for young people to continue on the family farm. So a lot of people are leaving, going to more comfortable, less labor intensive, higher paying jobs in towns and cities. So there's kind of a problem with the future of coffee as well, who's going to be farming it. Next slide. And then environmental issues with coffee, particularly Arabica coffee. The majority of if you buy beans or ground coffee, a lot of that's going to be Arabica coffee. It tastes better than Robusta, which is used in instant coffees. It requires very specific climatic conditions to grow. It can only be grown in, that kind of bean belt area, but even only very specific regions in that bean belt area. So with climate change, these conditions are changing rapidly. And looking at Brazil as the #1 producer, most of its coffee is grown in Minas Gerais and Sao Paulo. The percentage of suitable land is projected to decline from 70 to 75% to 20 to 25% due to the climate crisis. And in other areas, it may just become completely impossible. So thinking about how many people are dependent on coffee for income, this is a really scary situation for the coffee industry and for coffee farmers. Okay, another trivia question. What percentage of products in a grocery store contain added sugar? This was a shock to me. Would love to know what people's guesses would be. 90% we've got. Oh, 97, okay. 70. Yep, you're all pretty much on the right track. It's 80%. If you took away, I watched, if anyone's seen that sugar film, that sugar movie, he says, if you remove all the items from a grocery store that contain added sugar, only 20% would remain. Most of sugar in the world is also grown in Brazil as well. Next slide, please. And again, this is not a social issue from today, but a really shocking fact about sugar plantations during the transatlantic slave trade. The average lifespan was only 7 to 9 years. Sugar farming is very hard physical work. Today, it's still known as the hunger crop due to the low prices paid to farmers, meaning that they often just can't meet their basic needs. A similar story to coffee farmers. And going back to a lot of what Maggie was saying, a huge environmental issue with sugar is that they're the biggest driver of deforestation. Again, looking at Brazil, where most sugar is grown. 500 years ago, the Atlantic forest would have covered more than 1.5 million square kilometers, and more than 90% of that today is gone. So that has been cleared for timber, pasture, and sugar. And sugarcane farming is very damaging to rainforest areas because it takes out so much water from the soil. So now, after painting a very depressing picture, we're going to look at what the solution is. I would love to hear what people think when they hear the phrase fair trade. If you don't really know what it means, that's totally fine. A lot of people don't. Some of you will be very well versed in it. But anything that comes up for you when you hear this phrase, either a definition or just general thoughts. Producers are paid a fair wage for what they make. Yep. Goods that better support the communities where they're produced. Great suggestions. I'll give you a couple of definitions of fair trade because there are many. Fair labor practices, ecologically sound product production, exactly. Fair trade is a trading partnership based on dialogue, transparency, and respect that seeks greater equity in international trade. This is one definition from the Fair Trade Advocacy Office. Greater equity as an important part of that as well, because as we've seen, there is a lot of inequity, racial, also gender inequity on a lot of farms as well. So fair trade is really addressing that. And a second definition is this: fair trade is a change agent. It promotes a new way of being. Producers farm more responsibly, companies do business more responsibly, and consumers purchase more responsibly. So this definition really gives more of a focus on the holistic aspect of fair trade, of being a kind of a community effort across the supply chain as well. So both of these great definitions. To get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty, you have 10 fair trade principles, and I'm just seeing in the chat, this is really interesting. There's a lot of great comments coming up about skepticism around companies using the language of fair trade, difficult of regulating labels, greenwashing. This is all absolutely right. I'm going to talk here broadly about the fair trade movement. And these are the 10 fair trade principles as defined by the World Fair Trade Organization. So opportunities for disadvantaged producers, transparency is really important, knowing where products come from. Fair payment is probably the most fundamental aspect of fair trade. Things like no child labor, no forced labor, no discrimination, gender equity. All of these things are integral to fair trade and the fair trade movement. Finally, respect for the environment is a really important aspect. If the environment is people's home, it is their farmland. If farmers can't look after, if don't have the tools to properly look after their land, or that land is not able to produce for them, then that's also going to impact their incomes. So it's really important within fair trade to have this focus on the environmental aspect as well as the social. I just want to share very briefly 2 case studies of 2 fair trade coffee farmers that I met several years ago in Burundi. I was there to collect case studies about their work, and two of these farmers said that, well, the guy on the left, Jean, said that since joining the Fair Trade Cooperative, they'd installed a new station nearer his house where he could drop off his coffee, which meant that he no longer had to do the 2-hour walk with his wife and leave his children at home, and have to wait in line or even spend 48 hours waiting with no food, waiting to just drop off the coffee and get paid because they had no other choice. Estella on the right is a female leader at her cooperative. She talked about how in the past there was a lot of gender discrimination at the cooperative. Women would be pushed to the back of the line. Sometimes their coffee would be stolen, but the cooperative has deliberately prioritized women and created savings and credit groups that meet every week. So that helps the women, because if for some reason someone one week doesn't have enough money to pay their children's school fees, within that savings and credit group, they can pool the money, they will lend her the money and she will pay it back when she's able. So these are just some of the examples of how fair trade really positively impacts people when done right. Next slide, please. I'll now hand over to Maggie.
Thanks. So I want to really spotlight people-powered campaigns as one of the potential solutions to the issues we're talking about right now. Rainforest Action Network has a theory of change that if we push some of the biggest players in the industry, that we can change the whole industry, and that all of the other companies will follow suit. So we use a combination of investigations and frontline partnerships where we're really exploring the damage and the destruction that's happening and the impacts on communities on those front lines. And then we do engagement with the companies that are connected. We inform them about those connections and we agitate them to make changes. And then when they don't do what we ask and they don't come to the table or correct the issues that we point out, then we need to apply a little bit of pressure. And so that's the people-powered campaigns. We have digital campaigns. We have nonviolent direct action. And so next slide, please. I want to make sure I remember to share the action link with you when I get a chance to. But this next slide kind of just shows how some of the companies that we're talking about are tied to the dirty producers. So I'll talk about Procter & Gamble first. It's been one of our priority targets for the past couple of years. They're based out of Cincinnati, Ohio, and they make Tide and Gain laundry detergent, Downy. They also make Charmin, Bounty, Pampers, as well as Head and Shoulders, Pantene, Olay products. And then another company that we've been really pressuring is based right here in Chicago. And so that's part of the reason we've been wanting to build with folks in Chicago too, is to help put that people power pressure on Mondelez. And they're the makers of Oreos, Ritz, Chips Ahoy, Cliff Bars, Sour Patch Kids. Next slide. And so I'm going to drop in the link as soon as I stop talking, a link to one of our digital actions. And this is, I would love for you all to participate in sending a quick email. It only takes a couple clicks to the, I almost said executive director, that's the nonprofit side, to the CEO of Mondelez International, Dirk Van de Put, and let him know that you're in solidarity with these frontline communities that are facing deforestation and rights abuses, and push them to improve their policies. So I'll pass it back to you, Nancy, and then I'll drop that link in the chat.
Thanks, Maggie. So a question that we are really often asked at Chicago Fair Trade is, how do I do the best that I can do? How can I be an ethical consumer? What change can I make as an individual? And this can be overwhelming for a lot of the reasons that are being discussed in the chat. Next slide, please. But we have some tips on how you can do this and how you can have an impact. So important to underline also that many people will say there's no point in doing anything as an individual. It's corporations that have to change. That is absolutely true. Corporations do have to change. Corporations have a huge amount of power. However, we as individuals also have power. And we live in a capitalist system. So one of the most powerful things that you can do to affect change is by making informed decisions about how you're spending your money. And it also may mean not spending your money at all. Also because companies don't produce things that customers don't buy. So if more people, choose to buy in a particular way, that builds consumer demand, and that means companies listen. So a quote that we also like to share as well, sorry, just go back one sec, is that, can you go back to the last slide? Yeah, so every time you spend money, you're casting a vote for the kind of world that you want, which is just a very nice, succinct way of kind of explaining what I've just explained. Next slide, please. So being an ethical consumer. So step one, and I know that there will be, detractors from this, and I welcome that. We'll get into some of the issues with certifications as well. But let's talk about some of the certifications and kind of what they mean. So definitely encourage, when you're shopping in the supermarket, have a look, see if there is a label, first of all, just see if there is one. So some of the most common fair trade labels that you will see in the US are these three. So there's Fair Trade America or Fair Trade International. This is the one that is most internationally recognized. They have a very strong focus on the producers, the farmers. They also very much promote cooperatives as a business model that is democratic and egalitarian. You also see this on Ben & Jerry's. So Ben & Jerry's ice cream, they use Fair Trade International certified sugar and cocoa. Fair Trade USA, I'm imagining a lot of people on the call will have seen this one. This one is the most common in the US. It doesn't exist in products outside the US. They, in 2011, controversially split from Fair Trade International because their argument was that Fair Trade International was focusing too much on the cooperative level, and they wanted to have bigger impact by working with large-scale farms and even plantations. So this caused a huge amount of debate, rightly. A lot of people would say that this is democratizing fair trade, that you can get fair trade coffee now in Walmart or wherever, and that it's more accessible and more accessible price point to people. Other people will say, you've just watered down the standards and this is not true fair trade. So I say this because it's absolutely right to be skeptical of these certifications, and you do have to also understand what they mean. Unfortunately, it's not really made clear to consumers, and that's a very deliberate move on the part of a lot of companies. They don't really want you to look into it. They want you to see the label and go, oh, this is awesome. This is definitely fair trade, but you've also got to be critical as well. And then Fair for Life is a certification that is less common. It is gaining traction. I'm seeing it more and more. It has a slightly different approach. It covers the whole supply chain. So they're looking really at communication between each link of the supply chain and supply chain resilience. And something that is common with all of these certifications is that they are guaranteeing a minimum price. So they will say, okay, if coffee, for example, is sold on the commodity market and the price fluctuates beyond the control of farmers, they will always pay a set price for that coffee. Even if the commodity price goes down, they will stick at the price that they have offered. If the commodity price goes up, they will pay that price. They will be higher than the fair trade minimum price. They will also pay a fair trade premium to the farmer group. So this is something that a cooperative, for example, would democratically decide how they want to spend it. Okay, next slide, please. And then I won't go into too much detail on this because it's less relevant to food, but you also find membership organizations within fair trade. This is less common in food. This is more of a holistic, whole business focused approach. So Fair Trade Federation, World Fair Trade Organization also offer membership to businesses that are fully fair trade in everything they do within their operations. So as an example, Ben & Jerry's uses fair trade certified cocoa and sugar, but they're not a fair trade business. They're owned by Unilever. They don't have a fair trade structure. Chicago Fair Trade also has a similar structure. We offer membership to Chicagoland-based organizations only who work with maker groups both locally and internationally. And here's where it gets tricky. It would be wonderful if we could say, great, it has a label, you know it's fair trade. As I've said, that is not the reality. I don't want to completely bash certifications because there is absolutely value in having third-party standards and audits which give an objective account of the social environmental footprint of a product. It is useful. They absolutely do work, but it's not a silver bullet, and there's various reasons for this. Firstly, because some products cannot be certified. Coffee, sugar, cocoa, tea, bananas, palm oil, they're common products which do have fair trade certification standards, but others don't. So you simply cannot buy everything with a fair trade label on. Also because sets of standards that work really well in one context might not work very well in another. So something that works brilliantly in Honduras may not work very well in Burundi. Totally different culture, totally different customs, different laws, different staff. You know, just like with anything, the standards are meant to be standardized, but in practice that doesn't always work. Also because, as I mentioned, not all labels are created equal. It depends really on the specific standards of a certification. And also because when you have a lot of labels like Fair Trade International, like Fair Trade America, like Fair for Life, it does incentivize these certification givers to water down standards to capture more of the market of companies that want to be certified. So having a healthy dose of skepticism with this is really important. Another reason that we say certification isn't everything is because it can be really expensive and difficult to attain, especially for under-resourced cooperatives in the global south, for example, also small businesses that have limited funds and capacity. And finally, because it is not necessary to be certified to do good, right? Those fair trade principles that I showed on the screen earlier, businesses can still follow those and they don't have to be going through a certification process. Some businesses pay way above the market price that is determined by fair trade certifiers. Often these businesses will use terms like direct trade because they say, we're not fair trade, we don't like fair trade, we do things directly with the farmers. I would argue that this is conflating the broader global fair trade movement, which is generally making trade fair, with fair trade certification, which is a part of the fair trade movement, but isn't the whole thing. But it's interesting to hear some of the different terms, and many of these companies are, making very good and important points as well. So, look for the label, but also look beyond the label is my too long didn't read. Also, because some certifications are made in-house and they are owned and managed by the very same companies that sell the product. So that's a clear conflict of interest. That is not to say that it totally doesn't mean anything or they're not doing anything. But again, we have to be skeptical and know, because a lot of people would see this and think, great, it's a fair trade label. And it's not a third party label, it's managed by the business itself. So then I also recommend to do your own research. So go on the company's website. How transparent are they about their supply chain? Who is growing their ingredients? It doesn't necessarily mean that they're being fair if they're being transparent, but it's a positive indicator that they're opening themselves up to scrutiny. Also look into whether the company is making efforts to improve farmers' welfare. And also do outside sources back up or contradict the brand's claims. A lot of people have been talking about greenwashing in the comments, and the bigger the brand is, the more resources they have to do this. So it is really tricky. There is no easy solution to finding out how ethical a product is. It really involves doing your own research. And then finally, we also really strongly advocate for not feeling overwhelmed and guilty, striving to be perfectly ethical and sustainable. Make changes that work for your lifestyle and fit within your budget. This quote by Anne-Marie Bonneau, "We don't need a handful of people doing zero waste perfectly, we need millions of people doing it imperfectly," is a really good rule of thumb for this. And be mad at the system. Don't be mad at yourself. A lot of people say, oh, I feel really bad. I don't, I haven't bought fair trade coffee or whatever. It's not your individual fault. It is the system's fault. It's deeply unfair that we as consumers are complicit in the unethical behavior of brands. We should be able to shop safe in the knowledge that there's been no labor violations or deforestation or environmental harms involved in these products. It's also unfair that many ethical products come with a price premium. But, because many fair trade brands, are not cutting the same corners, that things do tend to be a bit more expensive, not always, but a lot of the time with kind of products you find in grocery stores. So finally, I'll just say, feeling guilty helps no one, but making even a small change does. So some just really quick and easy changes that could work for you. Make one fair trade swap when you go on your grocery shop. I personally, having worked a lot in coffee and met a lot of fair trade coffee farmers, always buy either fair trade certified or coffee with strong ethical credentials from direct trade brands or brands that I always do a bit of research on. Because as I said, coffee is one of the more expensive products in my grocery cart. So I'd rather that goes somewhere where it's gonna be, that money is gonna be directed towards the people that grow it. Buy less stuff, thrift, buy secondhand, unfollow social media influencers that encourage spending for the sake of spending. There's lots of people spreading really great content on social media. So it's just one way, if you do use social media, that you can just kind of change your mindset a little bit. Get informed about greenwashing, boycott brands that are badly behaved, like the Amazons, like the Nestle's of the world. And also follow us, join Rainforest Action Network's campaigns. I know Maggie shared some links in the chat already. If you're based in Chicagoland, Chicago Fair Trade hosts a lot of events where we talk about these issues, where we also have opportunities to buy fair trade, to join campaigns and protests. So we would love for you to join in on that. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and I'll come in just to have one more focus on people power before we wrap up the kind of presentation portion and get into some of the Q&A and some more interaction. But yeah, people power has changed the course of history. It changes culture, it changes policy, it changes laws. And as we were preparing for this presentation, we were kind of thinking of some of the examples from the United Farm Workers and their great boycott and how they were able to win better wages and safer working conditions for farmers, to the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, who are still organizing and campaigning for a fair food program, from the civil rights movement to the movement for Black Lives, and some of the work that we've done. Nancy shared some examples of how fair trade has changed the reality for coffee growers. Some of the work that we've done in RAN has helped win customary forest recognition for Indigenous communities in Indonesia. It's really slowed down and stopped deforestation in some of the critical areas that we've been focused on and working in. And just recently, Unilever has released a new policy on protecting human rights defenders, which has been a demand of ours. So we see that people power for the win, and direct action also gets the goods. So this picture right here, I just want to not give too much background, but it comes from an art project with Just Seeds, who some of y'all may be familiar with, and an Indonesian art collective, Tearing Patty, made this amazing print that we then used to create this giant parachute banner that we brought outside of the Mondelez headquarters last May during their annual shareholder meeting. And it says, forest defenders protect all life. I'm going to drop in the chat another sign up. On the slide, there's a sign up to RAN and the action that I shared, and you should absolutely do those things. But the link I'm going to share right now is for specific Chicago-based organizing. And this is a list that I will use to literally email and call folks to find out if you want to get involved in sending postcards to the CEO of Mondelez, or if you even want to show up for some actions that we might do here in the future. So please consider joining us, and I'd love to build with y'all. So I'll drop that link and pass it back to Nancy.
Thanks, Maggie. So I just put a Jamboard link in the chat. I thought a good way to kind of start wrapping up this conversation would be just have a think firstly about something that you can do personally to decolonize in your diet. And then the second one is just a space where if you would like to share resources with others on the call that would help them to do the same, that would be great. I've put mine in there. I've said I buy fair trade coffee, as I said before. And I've also put in the second slide about sharing something with others, a link to the Eco-Label Index, which is a really interesting resource. It is all 456, I think, certifications and labels that exist in the world. So it's interesting to just have a read through that. Excellent. Okay, and final slide. So I know we're almost right on time, but here are our socials and websites if you'd like to follow us. And if anyone would like to stick around for some questions, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I saw quite a few questions in the chat, so maybe we can start to dig into some.
I just wanted to highlight that the feedback poll is live. So if you want to, if you can please use this time to engage in the feedback poll, it will be really helpful.
Thanks, British. I just saw, I think, is it Aoife Sweeney's comment in there? Yes, I agree. It is completely colonial. These supply chains are colonial supply chains, as we discussed. That's where they come from. Decolonization is a big term. I would say that from our perspective as fair traders, we see fair trade as a way to utilize the existing supply chains, which can't really be undone. And a lot of farmers, unfortunately, are still dependent on producing things like coffee, and actually redirecting the money that has historically been extracted from these communities and redirecting those funds into them. So I agree, they are colonial supply chains, and it's a complex topic. I wish that certifications would, be 100% guarantee that everything is completely great. Often they are, honestly, but we're talking about every single supply chain in the world, every single country in the world. And so it's just it's a huge topic. But yes, it's definitely something that is, a huge global work in process.
Also coming in with another announcement, please don't forget that tomorrow is the in-person day at South Shore Cultural Center. We hope to see you there. And the next round of sessions will begin at 2 p.m. And once again, the poll is live. So please continue to stick around and engage in conversation, as well as take the poll. Thank you.
I saw one of the questions was asking about Nestle. So I just wanted to mention that Nestle is one of the 10 major brands that RAN is targeting in our Keep Forest Standing campaign. And yeah, one of the biggest players in the industry on a lot of fronts, but including in the palm oil trade. So yeah, we're pushing them along with Procter & Gamble, Mondelez, PepsiCo, Colgate Palmolive, Unilever. Yeah, some really big targets, really big opponents with really big budgets, especially around marketing. And so, yeah, we do need folks to join us and help, build our side of the power as well.
Yeah, I will also add, I'm just like a floating head here, I think, but this is Catherine from Chicago Fair Trade. And it's like, man, it's nice. You guys are so much more knowledgeable. And we're going into a lot of high schools and colleges, and honestly, and we, we're very transparent about there's no silver bullet. The capitalistic system has problems, but it's like, I think getting people to start to think about it at all is something still relatively new. So anyhow, not to be defensive, just saying like, it's so interesting to see the range of knowledge. And this is a very knowledgeable, engaged, awesome crowd, which is nice. A lot of times, you just start talking about this and it's kind of unbelievable to me, but people just being like, not even really thinking about Amazon, who purchase on Amazon constantly and don't think about it. So it's like, we got a long way to go, but as Nancy said, yeah, it's a complex world with every item that's traded, and yeah, there's a lot of work to be done.
All right, does anyone have any other questions or comments?
This might have gotten lost in the chat, but I just wanted to say I couldn't sign up on the spreadsheet because it's organization protected permissions.
Oh my gosh, thank you for letting me know. And I specifically went and thought that I changed that. So would you mind just sending me your info in the chat, and I'll collect it, because I'm not sure why it didn't work when I did that before. Thank you.